Well, hello everybody. I hope everything is going well. You know, the last few videos that I've done, I've been using a process which is relatively common with photographers called exposure blending. And I have gotten a few questions about the process that I went through to achieve some of the photographs that I did. So I thought I would do a video and briefly explain the process that I went through. All right, so without further ado, let's go over to Lightroom. Okay, one of the things that I've done is I've taken the original three images and I've brought them into a different folder in Lightroom, so I can just isolate those three images to show you exactly what I've done. Okay, if you look at this first image is actually the underexposed image, which I did to preserve the highlights in the sky here, as you can see. All right, the second image was basically a normally exposed image for the entire scene. And the third image was a long exposure of 4 minutes to actually smooth out the water here and give the water a nice, real smoothie, creamy appearance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all three of these images. So in Lightroom, just click the very first image, click Shift, and then click the last image. Now all three images are linked together. Now right-click, Edit in Photoshop, but we're going to go all the way down to the end and open as layers in Photoshop. All right, it's going to take Photoshop a second to load all of these images and process them, and I'll be right back in a second. It's finished processing and importing all three images. Now the very first thing that you want to do, you'd like to come around. The first image is highlighted. Click Shift, click the last image. Now that highlights all three images. Now the next thing you want to do is go over to Edit. And what you want to do is to align all three layers. You want Photoshop to make sure that all three layers are completely in line with each other, so you don't have any areas which are off. Okay, so align layers, click. Auto should be checked. I don't check vignette removal or geographic distortion, and click OK. And on this image, it should only take us a few seconds. Okay, and that's done. Now Photoshop has actually aligned all three images. Now if you look at the bottom, there's just apparently one of the images was just a little bit off. So you can see a little area down here at the bottom. Basically what I do to fix that, just go to the crop tool, and I'll just bring that up just a little bit to compensate for that. And click Enter. And that looks pretty good. Okay, now what I want to do first is the very first image is the one that should be on top. And what this image is going to do is I want to preserve the highlights in the sky. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to grab my brush here. It should be black. Now I want to create a layer mask for the very first image. So come down here, and there is our layer mask. Now what I do here, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase everything which is just below the sky from the bridge on down. And what I like to do with the layer mask is the hardness rather, should be 0. And let's increase the size of the brush. All right. Now, there we are. And we can see that this is taking away that entire first layer with the exception of the sky. The sky should remain as it is because I want to maintain the detail in the sky. Okay. So that's done. All right. The next thing I want to do, I want to turn off the very first layer and create a layer mask for the second layer. So I'll click the second layer and then click the layer mask icon. Click the layer mask. Now this particular one is going to expose the water and the long exposure, which is actually underneath. So if you can see this, this looks pretty good. Now in this particular instance, I want to determine, do I want to include everything in the long exposure or just portions of it? I go here, I go there. I actually like the detail that I'm getting in the long exposure on the rocks as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take away everything here. And you can see that the nice creamy texture of the water is beginning to come in now. All right. If you notice, I'm staying away from the rocks. I'm going to leave the rocks pretty much the way that they are. The exposure is actually about the same for both. It was just a long exposure for the water on this. Okay. All right, that looks good. All right, so now you can see the effect is here for the water. Now basically, what I will do is I will turn on the first layer. Now you can see that everything has really kicked in. Here. Here. Now there's a little spot right here that I think I will probably get rid of. That's a remnant. All right. All right, that looks good. All right, so this is actually the basically the final image. Now, if you look in the foreground is a bit dark and it could use a little bit more detail. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually kind of make some adjustments to the individual layers. Now, the second layer, I'm going to click that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the highlights here. And just make some small adjustments here in Photoshop. Image, adjustments, and go down to shadows and highlights. And I want to bring the highlights down on the bridge. And I like that right there. Okay. All right, the next thing I want to do for the bridge itself is to just work on the saturation, maybe just a little bit. Hue saturation. I'm kind of I love saturation. And I really want to bring that out. So I gave that about 11. Okay. Now the sky itself, let's just work on that just a little bit and kind of bring out the give the sky a bit more contrast. Well, first of all, I'm going to bring the exposure down just a little bit. Okay, right there. And then increase the contrast. All right. All right. Now, if you look at the water looks rather blue. I tend to like images that are rather cool, but that may not be the preference of a lot of people. Now, some of the remaining things I'm going to fix in Lightroom. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take these 3 images, highlight the first, click Shift, and click on the last, and then come down here and flatten the image. Alright, now all three images that I just imported into Photoshop are just one file. Now what I will do is I will click Save, and these will be imported right back into Lightroom. And then we can make some additional adjustments to this image. Okay, that's been done. So now I will close Photoshop. And now here's the image in Lightroom. Okay, now this is somewhat dark in the foreground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an adjustment brush, a local adjustment brush, and I'm just going to bring the exposure up. What I like to do is I like to click Show Select Mask Overlay so I can actually see exactly where everything is going. I'll come down here, density 100%, and that should be good. And I'll just mask this image here. And what I'm simply going to do is just increase the exposure a bit in this area. Now I could have done that initially, just brought up the shadows on the original RAW file, but it's just a matter of preference based on the image that you're processing at the time. And in this particular instance, I just decided to do this later on rather than at the very beginning. It doesn't have to be completely perfect, but I like to get it relatively close. Alright, I think that's good enough. Now uncheck Show Selected Mask Overlay. And now I can come over here to the Effects panel and I can raise the exposure. I think that's good for the exposure. Now I just bring up the shadows. And I think that looks good right about there. I don't want to bring in too much brightness and too much detail into the foreground because you want your eye to be directed toward what's in the center of the screen. Right, click Done. Actually, I think I'll warm this up a bit. It's a bit cool. Warm it up just a little, just a little. Okay, I think that's good. All right, the next thing. Now, perhaps the sky might not particularly be to your not the sky rather, but the water might not particularly be to your preference as far as the color. So we can also use an adjustment brush for that, which is what I actually did. So I'll click here and bring down the size of my brush a bit. And I just want to mask off this entire area. And basically just come in here. And of course I'm doing a very quick job on this. I took a lot more time initially when I processed the original image. But you just want to come through here and just mask off these areas. And then that will give you the ability to make changes to these areas. If you notice, I'm going around the rocks. I want to leave the rocks pretty much like they are. I like to make any additional changes to the rocks individually rather than along with everything else. And let's see, let's come down here and mask out the water. There's a very nice creamy effect. Long exposure will tend to do that. I realize that's not the preference of a lot of people, and it's not always my preference, but sometimes it does really work, especially if the image is in black and white. I get a smaller brush here, and I'll get some of the details here in the back. And of course, if you notice, I'm going around the rocks. Okay, that's good enough. Just for this tutorial, it doesn't have to be perfect. All right, uncheck Show Selected Mask Overlay. And I can come down to the effects panel for the local adjustments. And I can warm up the water a bit. And by warming up the water, that takes away some of the blue. I actually think that looks pretty good right there, because you do have the yellow here on the underpass of the bridge. So I think that's, and if you look here, you have some of the a golden reflection. So I think that looks pretty good. All right, so I'll basically leave it there. And I will click done for that. The only other thing that I might do, just for the sake of this tutorial, is to add a graduated filter. And I will come down just like this. And I will kind of cool off the sky just a bit more. About like that. And done. Now overall, what I will do is I will add some saturation to this. Sharpness and saturation. I'll add the sharpness to it now. And let's see what we've got here. I like to go right on the bridge. That looks good right there at about 64. And I will add a little bit of saturation to it. And I think that looks good about right there. And I think I'll just warm up the image just a little bit more. Okay. And that's basically what I did to achieve the final image that you saw in the original picture about a month ago. All right. Like I said, this isn't exactly what I did, but this is that was the basic premise for the entire process. So, as always, if you've enjoyed this video, please don't hesitate to comment, like, and please subscribe. All right, until next time.